I'm going to be audacious enough to try and sell to a bunch of engineers that the sari of 6 yards that I wear, a double ikat and a single ikat from the finest craft cluster of Sambalpur in Odisha, is one of the finest examples of applied mathematics. Good evening, I'm Susan Thomas, Director of National Institute of Fashion Technology, Bengaluru. And over the next 15 minutes, I'm going to take you through a journey where I connect the dots between textile, technology, culture, and civilization. If you would care to look at our language and our linguistics, the words textile, text, technology, all of it have the same root. It is texere, which means to weave. If you look at Sanskrit, tantram, or a treatise, is nothing but the loom. A sutra is nothing but the string or a thread. Over the past 1 month, I have been frazzled by the prospect of a TEDx. I've had to tie a lot of loose ends, and I'm sure a lot of the final years are on tenterhooks regarding their placements. What are the words that I have just used? All of these verbs and all of these nouns are all borrowed from textile technology, which is to say that textiles, weaving, and technology associated with making it is so closely associated with our day-to-day life that we often forget that the history of humanity as we have progressed is nothing but textile technology. And give me 15 minutes to prove it. There is a fabulous paper which has been written by Karen Hardy, and the title reads, The Prehistory of String Theory, How Twisted Fiber Helped to Shape the World. And the argument that she makes is very, very simple. The argument is that the very first manipulation of fiber, whether it be plant or whether it be animal-based, is the very foundation and the first ever technological innovation that humanity made. Think about a hunting-gathering society. How did we hunt an animal? If we are to use an arrow and a bow, where are we going to place the bow? It is on a string or it is on a thread. What about the fishing nets that we use? How did we use to pull that animal that we hunted to our homes or to our caves at that point of time? It is all because there was possible material manipulation that we all do in our labs in the form of twisting fiber, yarn, thread, the precursor of the thread. And which logically leads me to the next step, which is clothing or which is weaving. Weaving rests on the simple mathematical formula of intersection. 2 lines intersecting, the warp and the weft at 90 degrees. It cannot get more simpler than that, right? In 2019, NIFT Bengaluru students did the mural on the facade of Whitefield railway station. We were seized of the fact that Whitefield is a Silicon Valley capital of India. And I'm sure a lot of you would find yourself placed in Whitefield soon after you graduate from this institute. We were seized of the fact that a lot of engineers and a lot of ancillary industries and businesses associated with computing and computer programming do have a footprint in that Whitefield railway station. So we brainstormed, the students, the faculty, me as a director, we brainstormed over what design should actually go on to the mural. And serendipitously, the book that I was reading at that time was Sidney Padua's The Thrilling Adventures of Lovelace and Charles Babbage. This is the Whitefield railway station mural, which was executed by NIFT Bengaluru students in 2019. And if you would care to look at it, there is Countess Ada Lovelace. That's our aha moment. NIFT is 80% women, so we wanted to give visibility to women in technology and women in STEM. And she who worked along with Charles Babbage, who is credited with being the father of computing, is often a forgotten figure in the history of computing. So on one side of the wall, we have 2 of these giants. The pillars are the analytical engine prototypes, and there is a vivid spectrum rainbow Vibgyor-like interaction that is the visual representation that the students envisioned the interaction between the 2 great minds. This is a front view of it. And on the other side of the wall, you would see spokes of the analytical engine prototype. And surprisingly, you would also see flowers. right? And that is the Countess Ada Lovelace on one side. And the flowers are not visual elements by accident. I invite your attention to this quote. The analytical engine weaves algebraic patterns just as the Jacquard loom weaves flowers and leaves. This is what Ada Lovelace had to say about it. What is a Jacquard loom? Any ideas? Have you heard of a Jacquard loom? Okay. So Jacquard loom was invented by Joseph Jacquard in the early 1800s as a progressive step towards automating hand weaving. As I explained earlier, there is a warp thread and there is a weft thread, and you have to lift the warp and you have to intersperse the weft thread to get fabric, to get a cloth. And this lifting of the warp thread and the insertion of the weft, if you alter the color, the density of this weft thread, you can, the number of patterns and the number of textures that you can create is immense. What Jacquard did was very, very simple. He developed punch cards and made sure that the punch cards of the hole and the no hole, right? The hole and the no hole had the entire design into it, and through the hole would pass the thread. And so you would see Women Love Technology also has 01010, the binary code that is that you are all so familiar at computing. But I have to argue here that the very first computing or the very first programming that is known to human beings is the Jacquard punch cards. This is a portrait of Joseph Jacquard, which is made out of 24,000 punch cards. And this portrait was in the office and was made available to Charles Babbage, and he was so impressed with the idea of storing information in punch cards. This is the punch cards in a Jacquard loom, through which, and you know, with this kind of a program design, you can keep replicating it umpteen number of times. And this is the punch cards that Charles Babbage developed, which is part of the Science Museum now. See the amazing similarity? See how the dots connect? Even the dots that are connected, I mean, outside there is a beautiful visual representation of connecting the dots, and it is the string or the thread which is used there to connect the dots, right? This is the first programmer who is programming punch cards. And this is the prototype of the analytical engine, which you would have seen on the mural of Whitefield railway station as well. I'm going to put this on hold. I want to take you through the other elements of humanity and civilization also, which have been developed by clothing technology. Think about Agostino Bassi, who is one of the first entomologists to work on the calico disease of silkworm. And it was because silkworms were dying and the economy was distraught that he started his work. And the French translation of Bassi's work was made available to Louis Pasteur, who is eventually credited with the germ theory of disease. Right? So at the foundation of the germ theory of disease is not human beings or is not animals, but it is the silkworm, because the economy was disrupted with it. I can give you n number of examples. Euclid's Elements is said to have been inspired by mathematical computing involved in weaving in Greek vases. If you look at the pictorial representation of the warp threads and the weft threads, it is not so much the love of the abstraction of mathematics, but the practical necessity to weave clothing for humanity around. That is the argument here. Think about postal services. Scarsella Florentini, established sometime in 14th century across Pisa, Bruges, Barcelona, all were established basically to understand the prices in international markets for cloth like silk and cotton. I'm going to take a detour and seg into my own personal experience with clothing and weaving. In July 2020, right after we were breathing a little easy after the pandemic, the first wave of the pandemic, I hosted on my Instagram handle, Gangs of Ajrakpur, the hashtag Gangs of Ajrakpur, taking after the title of the movie of Vasepur, right? I take this craft of Ajrak, which is the pride of the subcontinent, practiced widely in Sindh, as well as Badmer in Rajasthan, and Kutch region of Gujarat. If you carefully look at the motifs, which is onto the right, you would see that there are the 8-petaled flowers and different other geometric figures which are repeated at different intervals. The dupatta on the left side, you would see rondelles, you would see kite shapes, And all of it, the caption in the center basically talks about tessellation. And tessellation, as mathematics students, you would all know that it is geometry imagined beautifully. If you would look at the last sari picture, which has the 8-petaled flower, it's something that you can simply create with a compass.
With a circle. The first major decision is, how will you divide it up? Most patterns split the circle into 4, 5, or 6 equal sections, and each division gives rise to distinctive patterns. There's an easy way to determine whether any pattern is based on 4-fold, 5-fold, or 6-fold symmetry. Most contain stars surrounded by petal shapes. Counting the number of rays on a starburst, or the number of petals around it, tells us what category the pattern falls into. A star with 6 rays, or surrounded by 6 petals, belongs in the 6-fold category. One with 8 petals is part of the 4-fold category, and so on. There's another secret ingredient in these designs, an underlying grid. Invisible but essential to every pattern, the grid helps determine the scale of the composition before work begins, keeps the pattern accurate, and facilitates the invention of incredible.
This is to show that the motifs which are on a textile is not really imagined out of curiosity and artistry, but rather Islamic geometry which has been developed in the 6th century, which takes you through patterns of this sort. So if you are sipping on Turkish chai by the Bosphorus, or standing under the ceiling of Humayun's tomb, or even if you are in Alhambra or Spain wearing a beautifully crafted ajrak piece of garment, chances are that you will be able to connect the dots between culture, civilization, and humanity through that one piece of clothing that you wear. Next up, 6 yards of single ikat and a double ikat from Sambalpur of Orissa. This sari spots both single ikat as well as double ikat. A single ikat is when only one yarn is resis dyed and woven, and double ikat is when both the warp and the weft are resis dyed and then woven together. You have to imagine that somebody whom we call illiterate can plot, a weaver or a dyer can actually plot the design on a graph paper and visualize it. How many warp yarns? Can anybody say how many warp yarns that would be required for weaving a 6-yard sari? Or how many weft yarns? How many should be colored in red, in black, in all the colors that you see here? So, which is to say that that there is a lot of mathematical computation which goes beyond numbers and which goes beyond formula that inspires weaving. In October 2020, to coincide with Mahatma Gandhi's birthday, I also hosted a hashtag of Khadigram on Instagram. Why Khadigram? Khadigram as a pun on Instagram as well as Khadi, which was also to argue that as a nation, we are about hand-woven, hand-woven textile and hand-spun yarn. It was not that Gandhi fired a gun, in the air or, released a pigeon or anything of that sort. What he did to shake the might of the British Empire was to go back to the prehistoric, was to go back to the simple tool of hand spinning, which is a charkha. Khadi defines who we are as a nation. It defines also Swaraj and Swavalamban, which are the primary 2 goals that the country that we call our motherland rests on. It would be surprising to many of you that when the national flag was designed, it was a charkha which was supposed to be at the center, but then somebody told about the design and the visual aesthetics of it in covering it from a 360-degree angle, and that was when charkha was displaced in favor of the Ashoka Chakra, right? So, politically, so the whole reason why I took handloom and hand weaving into this platform where engineers form majority is that it's time that young Turks like you would go back to weaving and build on the technology for millions and millions of weavers. We are looking in the ministry for young engineers to build on our blockchain, on our AI in terms of hand weaving, and in sheer automation, even if it is by way of their posture correcting a chair or some sort of an automated device that would help us in weaving. I want to leave you, to chew on that idea, which is worth spreading, that textile technology is who we are materially, emotionally, and technologically. I think it's fair enough for the youngsters to give it a good chance. Thank you so much.